The wind howled through the streets of New York, biting through coats and sending shivers down the spines of hurried pedestrians. Taxis honked impatiently, their lights flickering like fireflies in the night. The scent of roasted chestnuts mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee, lingering in the crisp air. Tucked into a quiet corner of an otherwise bustling avenue, a small cafe offered refuge from the cold. Inside, a few regulars occupied their usual spots. A businessman typing furiously on his laptop, a young woman sketching, an elderly man nursing his espresso. Then the door swung open, and a tall figure stepped inside. Barron Trump. A subtle shift rippled through the room. Conversations faltered. Some eyes flicked toward him, lingering just a second longer than usual. Dressed in a tailored black coat, his collar turned up against the cold, he moved with quiet confidence. His presence carried an unspoken weight. As he waited for his order, he exhaled softly, letting the steam from the espresso machine swirl around him. Then, from a nearby table, a voice cut through the air. "Must be nice." Barron turned slightly, his sharp blue eyes locking onto the source. A man, hunched over a chipped mug, his clothes worn, his face lined with hardship. He wasn't looking directly at Barron, but his voice carried a weight of experience, of bitterness. "Must be nice," the man repeated, lifting his gaze. "To have everything from the moment you're born." The cafe hushed. The barista stiffened slightly. A couple of customers exchanged glances, unsure whether to watch or look away. And in that moment, the city outside, the cold wind, the passing taxis, all of it faded into the background. Because what happened next would change everything. Have you ever judged someone based on appearances alone? Comment and let us know. Barron studied the man for a moment. He wasn't offended. He wasn't even surprised. People made assumptions about him all the time, because of his name, his family, his lifestyle. But something about this man made Barron stay instead of brushing it off. "Why do you think that?" he asked, his voice calm. The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Look at you, perfect coat, clean haircut, standing there like you own the world. Guys like you don't know what it's like to fight for anything." Barron took his coffee from the counter, paused, then did something unexpected. He walked over and pulled out the chair across from the man. "Mind if I sit?" The man blinked, caught off guard. "You serious?" "Yeah." The cafe had grown quieter now. Barron, the son of one of the most powerful figures in the country, was sitting across from a man who had lost everything. Two different worlds, colliding in the least expected place. "You really want to hear about struggle?" the man asked, narrowing his eyes. Barron nodded. "Yeah, I do." The man exhaled sharply. "All right, kid. Here's a story for you." He took a sip from his chipped mug and set it down. "I wasn't always like this," he started. "Had a job. Construction. Then one day, I fell. Literally. Broke my leg in 2 places. Boss let me go. Bills piled up. Rent was overdue. Before I knew it, I was out on the street." Barron listened without interrupting. "Thought I'd get back on my feet. Turns out, once you fall, people stop looking at you the same way. Friends stop calling. Employers don't want you. You become a ghost." He let out a bitter chuckle. "Guess that's why I'm sitting here, judging rich kids drinking coffee." Barron stirred his coffee slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe you just needed someone to listen." The man looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. "Have you ever felt invisible? Comment and let us know." The cafe remained quiet, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Mark, Barron had finally learned his name, shifted in his chair, studying him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He wasn't used to being listened to, especially by someone like Barron. "So, what's your struggle, kid?" Mark finally asked, tapping his fingers against his mug. Gotta be tough waking up in silk sheets. Barron exhaled, swirling his coffee before answering. You think money makes life easy. Mark chuckled dryly. It sure doesn't make it harder. Barron shook his head. It just makes the struggles different. No matter what I do, people see the name before they see me. It's like living in a cage, just one with velvet bars. Mark studied him for a moment, then leaned back. Guess everyone's got their own kind of prison. Barron nodded. Some just hide theirs better. A moment of silence stretched between them. The world outside continued moving. Cars speeding past. People rushing by. But inside, time seemed to slow. You ever think about what's next? Barron asked, breaking the quiet. For you, I mean. Mark let out a sharp breath, looking down at his hands. Next? Haven't thought that far. When you're on the streets, next is just about making it to tomorrow. Barron set down his cup. Maybe it's time to start thinking further ahead. Mark scoffed, shaking his head. Easier said than done, kid. Maybe, Barron admitted. But what if someone believed you could? Would that change anything? Mark's fingers tightened around his mug. He didn't answer right away. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure how to respond. Do you think belief in someone can change their path? Comment and let us know. Mark tapped his fingers against the edge of his coffee cup, his thoughts running in circles. The idea of thinking ahead felt foreign to him. For years, his life had been about surviving the day. Nothing more, nothing less. You really think it's that simple? He finally asked, glancing at Barron. Barron shrugged. Not simple, but possible. Mark scoffed. What do you know about possible? You've never had doors slammed in your face. Never had to fight just to get someone to look at you like you matter. Barron leaned forward. Maybe not, but I know that if you wait for life to change on its own, you'll be waiting forever. Silence. Mark stared at the swirling liquid in his cup, absorbing the weight of those words. He didn't want to admit it, but something about them stuck. What do you want, Mark? Barron pressed. Mark clenched his jaw. He hated that question. It reminded him of a time when he actually had an answer. I don't know, he muttered. Guess I stopped asking myself that a long time ago. Barron nodded, as if he understood. Maybe it's time to ask again. Mark exhaled, rubbing his temples. And what if I don't have an answer? Barron smirked. Then start small. One step. One decision. Doesn't have to be big. Just forward. Mark chuckled under his breath. You really think a conversation like this can change anything? Barron shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. But what if it could? Mark let those words settle. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a closed door. Have you ever felt stuck in life? What did you do to move forward? Comment and let us know. The cafe had grown quieter as the evening stretched on, but Mark's mind buzzed with thoughts. He had spent so long believing that change was impossible, that his future had already been written. But now, for the first time in years, he felt a crack in that certainty. One step, huh? Mark murmured, more to himself than to Barron. Barron nodded. That's all it takes. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just forward. Mark exhaled sharply, staring at the $50 bill Barron had casually slid across the table earlier. It wasn't about the money. He knew that now. It was about the choice it represented. What if I screw it up? Mark asked, his voice quieter this time. Barron smirked. Then you try again. Mark huffed a laugh, shaking his head. Easy for you to say. You think I've never failed. Barron countered, leaning in. People expect me to have it all figured out. The truth is, I don't. No one does. The difference is whether you keep going anyway. Mark let those words settle. He glanced out the window, watching the city move around him. New York didn't stop. Maybe he shouldn't either. With a deep breath, He grabbed the bill and stuffed it into his pocket. All right, one step. Barron's expression didn't change, but there was something like approval in his gaze. Good. The conversation shifted after that. Nothing heavy. Just two men from different worlds, talking about everything and nothing. And when they eventually parted ways, Mark found himself standing outside, staring at the city with new eyes. The first step was always the hardest, but for the first time in years, he was ready to take it. Have you ever hesitated before taking a leap of faith? What made you finally go for it? Comment and let us know. Mark woke up the next morning with an unfamiliar feeling, purpose. He wasn't sure what to do with it. For years, his routine had been about survival, not progress. But today felt different. He walked past the same alleyways, the same street corners where he had spent too many nights. The city looked the same, but he no longer felt like a forgotten piece of it. Stopping outside a rundown job center, he hesitated. The old version of himself would have kept walking, but Barron's words echoed in his mind. One step. He stepped inside. The woman at the front desk barely looked up, looking for work. Mark swallowed. Yeah. She handed him a clipboard. Fill this out. Mark took a seat, pen shaking slightly in his fingers. As he filled in his name, a strange thought hit him. When was the last time he had written it on something that mattered? After what felt like forever, he turned in the form. The woman scanned it quickly. We have a warehouse position open. You up for it? Mark didn't hesitate. Yeah. She nodded. Report tomorrow at 6 a.m. Don't be late. Mark walked out into the crisp air, gripping the paper in his hands. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later that night, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Barron, how'd today go? Mark smirked, typing back. Mark, one step at a time. He pocketed his phone, staring at the city lights. For the first time in years, he had somewhere to be tomorrow. Have you ever had to start over? What was your first step? Comment and let us know. Mark stood outside the warehouse at 5:45 a.m., shifting his weight from foot to foot. The air was cold, and every fiber of his being told him to turn around. Old habits whispered in his ear, reminding him that failure was easier than trying. But today, he ignored them. The door creaked open, and a stocky man in a reflective vest stepped out. You the new guy? Mark nodded. Yeah. The man eyed him, then jerked his thumb toward the inside. Clock in and grab some gloves. You mess up, you're gone. Mark swallowed his nerves and stepped in. The work was grueling. Lifting, stacking, sorting. By noon, his arms burned and his back ached. But for the first time in a long time, the pain meant something. It meant he was doing something real. During lunch, another worker slid onto the bench next to him. First day's hell, huh? He said, biting into a sandwich. Mark chuckled. Something like that. The man smirked. Name's Jose. Stick around, it gets easier. Mark wasn't sure if that was true, but he nodded anyway. One step at a time. That night, as he collapsed onto the thin mattress in his small rented room, his phone buzzed. Barron, how was day one? Mark stared at the message for a long time before replying. Mark, hell. But I think I'll go back tomorrow. A few seconds later, another message came through. Barron, good. Keep going. Mark smiled to himself. He wasn't fixed. He wasn't saved. But for the first time in a long time, he had a reason to wake up tomorrow. Have you ever pushed through a moment where you wanted to quit? What kept you going? Comment and let us know. The second day at the warehouse was worse than the first. Mark's muscles screamed in protest, his hands raw from gripping heavy boxes, his legs aching with every step. He had expected it to get easier, but instead, it felt like his body was waging a war against him. By midday, the air inside the warehouse was thick with sweat and dust. The constant sound of machinery hummed in the background, blending with the occasional shouts of supervisors barking orders. Mark did his best to keep up, but fatigue was setting in faster than he liked. "Hey man," Joe's called out during their short break. "You good?" Mark exhaled, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Barely." Hose chuckled, handing him a water bottle. "You'll get used to it. Everyone thinks about quitting in the first week." Mark hesitated, gripping the bottle tightly. He had quit so many times before. When things got tough, when doors closed, when the world pushed back, he always found a reason to walk away. But something was different now. The image of Barron's text flashed in his mind. "Keep going." He took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll stick it out." By the time his shift ended, Mark could barely lift his arms. The walk back to his small rented room felt longer than usual, his body screaming for rest. He dropped onto the mattress, exhaustion pulling him into sleep almost instantly. But before his eyes closed, his phone buzzed. "Barron, day 2. Mark's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He could lie. Say it was fine. Say he was doing great. Instead, he typed, "Brutal, but I'm still here." A pause, then another buzz. "Barron, good. That's all that matters." Mark stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down beside him. He wasn't sure where this road led, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't turning back. Have you ever felt like giving up, but something kept you going? Share your story in the comments. The days turned into a week. Mark's body ached, his hands were covered in blisters, and every night, exhaustion pulled him into a deep, dreamless sleep. But he kept showing up. Each morning, the temptation to quit tugged at him. The warehouse was relentless. No breaks for weakness, no sympathy for sore muscles. The supervisors barely acknowledged him, treating him like just another body moving boxes. And yet, every day, he clocked in, pushed through the pain, and walked out just a little stronger than before. One evening, as Mark sat on the steps outside his tiny apartment, he stared at the city lights flickering in the distance. The noise of New York at once felt like an overwhelming force, drowning him out, making him feel invisible. Now, it was different. The hum of life, the sound of possibility. It was still out of reach, but maybe, just maybe, he was getting closer. His phone buzzed. Barron, still standing. Mark smirked, shaking his head. He didn't even think twice before replying. Mark, barely, but yeah. A pause, then another buzz. Barron, good. Keep moving. Mark exhaled, resting his elbows on his knees. He had never really had someone checking in on him before. It was strange, but he didn't hate it. The next day at work, Joe's handed Mark a pair of work gloves. "Here," he said, tossing them to him. "No need to keep tearing up your hands like a rookie." Mark caught them, surprised. "Thanks." Hose shrugged. "You're sticking around. Figured you might as well stop looking like you want to die every shift." Mark chuckled, sliding on the gloves. They fit snugly, protecting his raw skin. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Have you ever gone through something tough and come out stronger? Tell us your story in the comments. 2 weeks into the job, Mark no longer felt like an outsider at the warehouse. The work was still grueling, but his body had adjusted. The aches were still there, but they weren't unbearable. He was learning the rhythm, figuring out how to pace himself, how to keep up without burning out too quickly. What surprised him the most, though, was how much he had started to care. He wasn't just working to survive anymore. He was trying to build something. It was a foreign feeling. During a break, he leaned against a stack of pallets, sipping water from a dented bottle. Hose sat next to him, scrolling through his phone. You ever think about what's next? Mark asked. Hose raised an eyebrow. Next. Next as in what? Mark shrugged. I don't know. Like, this job is fine. But do you ever think about doing something else? Something bigger? Hose smirked. Bigger than stacking boxes. Man, I try not to think too hard about that stuff. Thinking too much gets you in trouble. Mark chuckled, but didn't respond right away. Maybe Hose was right. Thinking too much had never done him any favors. Still, the thought lingered. That night, Mark found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his tiny apartment. He barely recognized himself. The exhaustion in his eyes was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't the hollow kind of exhaustion that came from drifting through life without direction. It was the kind that came from effort, from moving forward. His phone buzzed on the counter. Barron. Still pushing. Mark smirked, picking up his phone. Mark, yeah. You? Barron. Always. Mark exhaled, setting the phone down. He didn't know where this road was leading him. But for the first time in years, he actually wanted to find out. Have you ever felt like you were finally moving forward after being stuck for too long? Tell us in the comments. A month had passed. Mark had settled into the job, the routine, the sense of purpose. It still wasn't easy, but it wasn't impossible either. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was building something. One evening, as he was clocking out, the warehouse manager approached him. Mark, got a minute? Mark tensed. Yeah, what's up? The manager folded his arms. We got a supervisor position opening up. Pays better, more stable hours. You interested? Mark blinked. Him. A supervisor. It felt surreal. I don't know, he admitted. I've never managed anyone before. The manager smirked. You're dependable. You show up. That's half the battle. Think about it. Let me know by Friday. As Mark walked home, his mind raced. A promotion. A step forward. But was he ready? Could he handle it? That night, he stared at his phone before finally typing. Mark, ever felt like you weren't ready for something, even when it was a good thing? A pause. Barron, all the time. Do it anyway. Mark chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe Barron was right. Maybe it was time to stop doubting and start believing. Have you ever been afraid to take an opportunity? What did you do? Tell us in the comments. Friday came faster than Mark expected. The weight of the decision pressed on him as he walked into work. The idea of taking on responsibility scared him, but something inside him whispered, this is the next step. At lunch, Hose nudged him. You gonna take it? The supervisor spot. Mark exhaled. I don't know, man. What if I screw it up? Hose smirked. Then you learn and get better. Ain't that what life's about? Mark thought about that as he stood outside the manager's office. His old self would have walked away, convinced he wasn't meant for more. But he wasn't that person anymore. He knocked. The manager glanced up. Well. Mark straightened his shoulders. I'll take it. And nod. Good. You start Monday. Walking home that evening, Mark felt something he hadn't in years. Pride. He had chosen growth over fear. He pulled out his phone and sent a message. Mark. Took the job. Barron. Knew you would. Mark chuckled. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally becoming the person he was meant to be. Have you ever stepped outside your comfort zone? What happened? Tell us in the comments. Months had passed since that night in the cafe. The city still moved at its relentless pace, but for Mark, everything had changed. He had a job, not just a job, but a career. He had stability. He had hope. One evening, he found himself walking past the same cafe where he had met Barron. The neon light flickered above the doorway, casting a familiar glow. Without thinking, he stepped inside. He ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching the world move outside. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. His phone buzzed. "Barron, how's life on the other side?" Mark smirked. "Mark, different, better." A pause, then another message. "Barron, told you." Mark shook his head, taking a sip of his coffee. He had come full circle, but this time, he wasn't lost. Has a single moment ever changed your life? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on new iconic stories.